So I got myself into the strange position of being able to draw people without clothes pretty well, because that's what we do in life drawing, and really badly when they do have clothes on. It would look like I just sort of stuck blobs onto them, not like fabric at all. And it turns out people like to wear clothes a lot, so that's a problem. And I tried to look up how to draw clothes and came across a lot of information about the 7 fold types, half-lock folds and all of this. For whatever reason, this didn't work for me. It was a bit like when trying to learn figure drawing. At first, I just opened an anatomy book and started trying to learn all the muscles, and it didn't help me at all, even though people say, just learn the anatomy. What worked for figures also worked for me for clothing in the end, which is to really simplify what we're seeing based on understanding what's happening. So in the figure, it's like, oh, the ribcage egg shape is facing that way, the simple pelvis pants face is facing that way, so there's a twist up the torso, and I'm just going to draw that twisting. So really simplifying based on understanding what's happening. And so the first thing to do is we're going to try to, in simple terms, understand what we're seeing when we're seeing clothes on a person. Now, the first thing that was helpful to me to get started was just understanding the basic structure and form of most clothes, which my friend Jared explained to me. And that is, they're a sequence of tube-like shapes, cylindrical shapes. So in this t-shirt, we have a sort of big tube around the torso, and then little tubes in the sleeves coming off that. And when you think about trousers, they're like a big pair of tubes, 2 tubes, and then gloves, this is a weird digital drawing glove, but you know, little tube shapes around the fingers and then a kind of tube shape around the palm. Basically, clothes end up being a set of tubes. And then the body is going to like push and pull and squash those tubes. And we're just trying to understand that. So let's have a quick look at what I mean. So here we've got simplified figures. If you're not sure how to draw simplified figures, I think that is the most important starting point, and I'll put tutorials for how to do that below. And what we're going to do is, if we look at the one on the left, we've kind of got this jumper. It's a set of tubes, right? A big tube around the torso, big tubes around the arms for the sleeves, tubes at the wrists. Pretty baggy jumper because the clothing tubes are a lot bigger than the figure itself. And in this version, we've kind of imagined it's able to fill all the space that it wants to fill. So it's almost like, you know, this person is lifting their arms so that there doesn't need to be any folding around the armpits. There's like air blown into this thing, or there's no gravity acting on it. So it's just able to fill the space it wants to fill. So it doesn't need to fold in this case. In the version on the right though, arms have come down, gravity's been applied, there's no air being blown into it. And so the amount of space that this fabric is able to fill is much less. And this means it needs to fold in on itself. So when we look at this t-shirt, if I kind of hold it out, stretch it out like this, it doesn't need to fold very much. And then obviously if I reduce the amount of space, it needs to start to fold in on itself. Now, something that's kind of makes things kind of simpler to understand is that when fabric folds in on itself, because there's not enough space for it to fill it the way that it wants to, then it's going to kind of fold in on itself in a sort of tube-like structure. So the clothing structure itself is like a bunch of cylindrical shapes. When you have these folds, they're basically like cylindrical shapes. So just to clarify this a bit more, let's say we have a piece of fabric like this, and it's just hanging. We're looking at it from a bit of an angle, and it's just kind of hanging down. It's pinned up in the corners so that the space between the pins is about the same as the width of the fabric, so it doesn't need to fold, right? It doesn't need to fold in on itself. So then let's say this fabric, which is pinned up, starts to get pushed up a little bit from the bottom. It starts to sort of get compressed from the bottom. And so what might start to happen then is it starts to fold in on itself, right? Because there's less space, vertically speaking, now, and it can't stretch out the way it wants to. So it might start to fold in on itself, and the way that those folds might appear, it might be like these sort of half cylindrical shapes. So one here, They're kind of becoming like these kind of half tubes. Or let's say it was kind of like a towel hanging off a railing, right? So it's hanging off a railing, and then someone comes along and pushes the ends of this towel inwards, and now it needs to fold in on itself, but it's going to do that with kind of these vertical tubes now, kind of like this. And so what's going to happen is we're going to get these kind of half tube-like shapes running along this vertically now. So now, because it's being sort of squashed in horizontally, these vertical tubes are going to appear. When it was getting squashed vertically, these horizontal tubes were appearing. So let's look at this t-shirt and try and understand what's happening. I think that if this person had their arms out a little bit and we blew air up into this t-shirt, it would want to kind of be this big, right? Without any folding, it would kind of be like this. That's what it wants to be like, right? That's how it's constructed. But this person's torso is a little bit narrower than that, and then the arms have dropped down. And so because the arms are dropping down, the t-shirt gets squashed a little bit in the armpit here. But also, because the overall torso width is not as wide as the t-shirt needs to fold in on itself to accommodate that. And so it's starting to kind of do this. Yeah, just like a curtain, which, you know, where you kind of open the curtains, which means you squash the curtains into a small space, and suddenly they're making these kind of compressed tubes vertically. That's what we've got here, right? And so can you see these kind of tube-like shapes? Right? It's kind of like half of a tube, and they're running this way because that's how this t-shirt is being squashed. Does that make sense? And then things change down here. So why is that? Well, the t-shirt is kind of hanging off the back and allowed to hang. And so in sort of along here vertically, there's nothing squashing it. But then it hits the butt and the hips, and that makes a sort of shelf, which is then pushing up on this tube of the t-shirt and creating a little bit of compression right here. But this time, instead of it being squashed this way and making these vertical tubes, this time it's squashed up this way, and now we're getting horizontal tubes. But they're still basically tube-like shapes, right? Kind of like these half tube-like shapes. So then when it comes time to try to draw this person's t-shirt, I can, you know, put in the overall sort of shape of this t-shirt. When it comes time to try to understand the folds, I can think about the vertical nature of the folds here and the horizontal nature of the folds here. And when I'm thinking about what are these folds like, they're kind of like a series of these half tube-like shapes. So this is great. The next thing that I really want to understand though is that I don't want to draw all of these folds. There's 5 million folds most of the time with clothing, and I don't want to draw 5 million folds. So what I can end up then doing is I can have my t-shirt, right? And I want to explain there's some horizontal folding down here. So I'll draw some of these horizontal folds. And I want to explain there's some vertical folding here. But instead of drawing all of them and making a big sort of mess, I just want to explain enough to show that there is that kind of folding. And I'm going to show you there's more to it than that, but I just want to introduce this idea that we're not going to try to draw every single thing that we're seeing. So how do you reduce the amount of folding that you're drawing? How do you reduce the number of lines that you use to draw this? This is something that we will go over. But first, we're just trying to observe. So everyone, we're out in the street, we're looking at people, and we're trying to understand the folds that we're seeing. So here is a man walking along, and he has a jacket. I can understand that the jacket is essentially like a massive cylindrical shape for the torso, and it goes right down over the legs, and then cylindrical shapes in the sleeves. If it was to be fully kind of filled out, it would just be like that, like a big tube with 2 tubes on the sides. but it's wrapping around his figure and he is bending his arms and he's got hands in his pockets, and this is changing it and it's having to fold to accommodate. Okay, great. So one thing is the arms are brought down a bit, and that's creating some compression, some bunching up here. So if we come in here, we can see that the fabric is having to fold in on itself over here because it's being squashed, right? The arm is squashing it against the torso. And so we've got a tube, we've got these little tube shapes happening here, like that. And then they kind of dissipate as they come over to this side because that compression isn't happening on this side. So we don't have these tube shapes on this side. We do have them over here on this side, and they kind of dissipate as they go from one side to the other. So this makes a lot of sense, hopefully. And these tubes are actually affecting the outline that we're seeing on this side as well, which is a little clue for something that we're going to do when we're actually drawing this stuff. So we're not yet actually ready to start drawing stuff, right? Now, if we come into this elbow, you can imagine that if you were looking at this sleeve from the side, what it wants to do is be straight tube, but the arm inside is being bent, right? So let me do the arm in red. So the arm inside is being bent, all right? So we're looking at it from the side, let's imagine. So as it goes around the elbow, it doesn't need to fold in on itself. If anything, it's being stretched out a little bit. But on the inner side of the elbow, it's being squashed together and it's going to have to fold in on itself here. And so what we're going to get is we're going to get a bunch of tube-like folds as it folds in on itself on the inside of the elbow, and then those are going to dissipate as they go around the arm to the outer side of the elbow where it doesn't need, just like we saw here, right? Just like there, that's going to be happening. But this time we're looking at the back of the arm, and so what we're seeing is the stretched out bit of fabric here, so there's no tubes along here, right? There's no folding in on itself. On the inner side that we can't see round the back, there is, and so what we're seeing is those folds that are appearing on the inside of the elbow kind of dissipating as they come round to the back. Now we can see that over here as well. Not much folding on the outer side, but lots of folding on the inner side because the arm is a little bit bent. All right, so it makes a lot of sense suddenly. And then what we're going to end up doing later is we're not going to draw all these folds. We're just going to draw just enough information to explain the compression, but we don't want to copy all the folds out. All right, cool. So another thing that happens with fabric is when we have a tension point, so when something is pulling on this fabric, we're going to get tube-like folding going towards that tension point. All right, so if basically what's happening is that a lot of this fabric is getting pulled towards one point, to a narrow point, and it's having to fold in on itself because it all wants to go up to this point. It's all being pulled to this single narrow point, and so there's a wide bit of fabric all trying to go to the same place, and so it's folding in on itself, right? So we get a bunch of tube-like shapes going to the tension point. We've had some examples where the fabric is getting squashed and compressed, and it's folding in on itself and making these little tube-like shapes. But we've also got times where it's getting pulled at along a tension point, and it's going to make those same shapes going towards the tension point. So for example here, he's got his hand in his pocket, right? And so the hand here is pulling at the jacket. It's pulling things forward as he walks. And so we're getting these tube-like shapes going towards that hand. All right, it's all going towards the hand. So when it comes time later to draw this, we'll know that this is a tension point, and we'll try to indicate some of these ideas going up towards that tension point. All right, but not all of them, like I keep going on about. All right, cool. So here's another nice example, some people chilling out, eating some pizza. All right, so what we've got is a loose t-shirt, right? So the amount of fabric is bigger than the figure. So the fabric doesn't have as much space as it wants to fill out, it's going to have to start to fold in on itself a little bit somewhere. Now, what we've got is we've got the shoulder here, and that is supporting the fabric over here. And so we get this kind of like a little bit of a tension point, and so we get some folding up in this shoulder that's going towards that, right? It's pulling on the fabric, and we're getting a little bit of folding going towards that point. But it's not super extreme. And so one thing we're going to do later on is we're going to think, is the folding sort of strong enough for us to make a big deal out of it or not? In this case, it's not folding over so much that it's creating an overlap. So if we look at the sleeve over here, it's folding over so much that we're getting one bit of sleeve kind of coming in front of another bit and covering it up. That doesn't happen here. It's more just like a gentle wave like this. And there's no bit that is kind of turning completely away from our eyes, whereas on this sleeve, we've got folds turning really strongly. So when we're observing these folds, it's worth thinking, how strong is this folding? Are there sections that are overlapping, coming in front of other sections? Because if there are, we're going to probably use some lines for that in our drawing, or if it's a painting, we might use harder edges for that, right? All right, so let's think about this sleeve. What is happening? It is a tube, but it's not fully stretched out, so it's having to fold in on itself. So it's kind of being squashed this way. And that means that the folds run perpendicular to that, and they are just really a bunch of tube-like shapes that go in this direction. Now things do get a little bit more complicated when you just have a tube and it's getting compressed like this, because what ends up happening is it wants to start to just fold in on itself a bit, like, you know, like we saw earlier with this kind of tea towel that was just hanging down, and it wants to just kind of do this, right? It wants to just start to fold in on itself like that in a simple way. But because it's a tube, it needs to stay the same circumference all the way down. So if this tube starts to try and do this all the way down, right? If it just kind of evenly and uniformly does this, it's going to be wider at some points and then narrower at some points. And that doesn't work, right? Because fundamentally the fabric is the same circumference all the way down. So this means that the way that it folds, it starts to get a little bit more complicated. And that creates these kind of what in the 7 fold types are called the zigzag folds, but it basically means that the folds are starting to kind of alternate. The way that these folds are occurring, these tube-like folds, rather than just being uniform like this, right, which it can't do because then it's getting narrower and thinner, it's kind of alternating so that it can still fold in on itself but stay the same width. And so this is when it's kind of useful to think about, all right, these kind of zigzagging folds. But again, we don't want to draw all of them, and they don't always appear the same way as well. What we can look in more detail, I guess, later at how we're going to tackle these more complicated folds, how we can simplify them. But that's the kind of basic idea of understanding what we're looking at, which is all we're trying to do right now. All right, if we come down here, we see what we noticed earlier, which is as the fabric can hang down, it is not, it's getting kind of squashed in this way a little bit on her side, and so it's creating these kind of vertical folds. Once it starts to come down here though, this thigh is pushing up on it, and that's creating a lot of bunching up like this, and that's making these horizontal tube-like shapes over here, which we just noticed. So then when it comes time to draw this, we're going to draw these folds coming down, understanding the vertical nature of them, and then they're going to turn into these more horizontal folds. They're kind of wrapping over this tube-like thigh. All right, so this is all making a nice bit of sense. We had a little bit of a complication here with these kind of alternating or interlocking tube-like folds that kind of make this zigzagging shape, or X, letter X type of shape, which is the way that I think Tom Fox describes those folds. So I think this is a good amount to get things started, and you can go about your life, unlike life drawing where you need to get special references or go to a life drawing class or whatever. Seeing clothing, you can just be out and seeing it all the time, and you can notice these folds and just imagining, what do these clothes want to, what shape do they want to take? They want to kind of, if they're fully, there's no folds in them, what would they be? They'd be these kind of big sort of tubes or whatever. And then thinking, but the pose and the figure are not allowing them to do that. So they're having to fold in on themselves. But why? Where are they getting squashed? Where is their tension pulling on them? And then what are the kind of tube-like folding in on themselves folds happening? And why are they appearing that way? And just trying to start to understand that. And then later we're going to think about then how to draw these ideas, massively reducing the amount of information, which is the second key to this whole thing. So I hope this is exciting for you, because this really cracked drawing clothing for me, and it's really fun to draw clothing. It adds so much, adds a lot of character, but also adds a ton of nice shapes. And you can mess with it a little bit more than you can mess with the figure. You can redesign the folds to suit your composition, especially when you understand why the folds are happening. You can redraw them the way you want. And in fact, Ryan Woodward, I think I read him say that he just thinks about where are the tension points and then redesigns the folds to suit what he wants, rather than trying to match what he's seeing, which is very interesting. Before you do any of this, what really matters first is the actual underlying figure and pose, at least in terms of simple forms. You don't need the details of the anatomy and the muscles and things, because they're being covered by clothes, but you need the simplified form at least, and understand that. And for that, we have a free mini course called Fresh Eyes in our study group, which is our amazing paid membership where you get support, all our courses. You get a full course called Foundations about this. So that would be the first thing to really get confident with, and then you can jump into this awesome stuff about clothing and folds.